To a review of Reconstruction. We're going to go through the entire topic of Reconstruction in these videos, and my hope is that it will first reinforce things that we did in class last week. It's going to supplement the class that we did not have on Friday since you were both out, and then it will also finish the chapter so that when we go in tomorrow, we'll be able to really just concentrate on skills, on primary document analysis, and not really have to spend too much time going over content again. But I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge what today is, so I just wanted to share a quote with you from Dr. Martin Luther King and think about how this actually relates to the Reconstruction unit in many ways. So, the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. Excuse me. So to me, Dr. King was not a pioneer in the true sense of the word. There were other people, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Sojourner Truth. There were many other famous Black people in U.S. history that promoted the elevation of Black youth through education. But we must acknowledge that today is to honor Dr. King specifically. And when we talk about the Civil Rights Movement later in the year, we can talk about the other people who very much maybe acted behind the scenes and don't get the same kind of acknowledgement as Dr. King, but nonetheless, a very great figure in U.S. history and one that we should never forget. So we shouldn't just treat this as a day off, but as a day of remembrance. So linking it back to Reconstruction, in a lot of ways, because Reconstruction, in my mind, essentially failed, that necessitated the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, which we are celebrating today. So without further ado, let's start talking about the nuts and bolts of Reconstruction. So again, thanks to the retired teacher from Chappaqua, Susan Poger, for setting up the basis of this PowerPoint, which I modified. First off, let's think about the major issues that are at play with Reconstruction. So these are the four sort of pivotal questions that the federal government was faced with when it was piecing back together the Union after the Civil War. So first off, how do we bring the South back? Right? At this point, the southern states had actually seceded. Technically speaking, they were no longer part of the Union. So this is a major issue. Do we punish them further? Do we sort of almost put them effectively on probation? Do we suspend the voting rights of any former Confederates? These are all questions that were running through the minds of mainly the Republicans in Congress and the president, of course. The second, how do we rebuild the South after its destruction during the Civil War? So this is very much logistical, it's a physical question, right? We already know about scorched earth policy, especially in the state of Georgia, but this was not at all exclusive to Georgia. The city of Richmond was almost destroyed by fire and other damages during the war itself. The cotton economy sort of lay in shambles because so much cotton was destroyed. And of course, for better or for worse, with the end of slavery, this also sort of forced the South to reimagine how it was going to design a new structure of labor without free labor. So I obviously see this as a good thing because it ended slavery, but still, it definitely presented a huge economic problem for the South to deal with. Number three, how do we integrate and protect newly emancipated Black freedmen? So in a lot of ways, this is something that kind of applied more to the earlier stages of Reconstruction. More of the radical Republicans they were ardent abolitionists before the war, and they really wanted to see to it that, Black men specifically, not Black women, that's an important thing to acknowledge, but that Black men could get full civil rights, that would get voting rights, they would be able to run and hold office. Those were the really progressive things that the Republicans were pushing for, and we're going to see how that kind of strays away as Reconstruction goes on. Number four, what branch of government should control the process of Reconstruction? So, excuse me, we're going to see that in a lot of ways, Reconstruction becomes a battle between all three branches of government. At the early stages, we could say it's mainly a battle between the executive and the legislative branch, but then when Reconstruction legislation is actually passed, we're going to encounter a lot of involvement with the Supreme Court as well, ultimately interpreting Reconstruction legislation, and we'll see what happens with that. So first, we should talk about the Reconstruction plans that were already in effect during the war. We talked about these in class, but a review is always hopefully helpful. So the 10% plan. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because we already talked about it. So this is actually, again, this is designed before the war is over, right? So the war formally ended in April of 1863, and this plan was put in place in December. At this point, it was already pretty much it was pretty predictable that the South was going to surrender. It was just a question of when. So ultimately, the 10% plan, like we know, is going to, first off, almost kind of reinforce the idea that the war was fundamentally to preserve the Union, because Lincoln is very quickly going to try to reabsorb the seceded Southern states. And it seems like he's very lenient in his plan, right? His Reconstruction plan did not involve consultation with Congress, so there are going to be radical Republicans in Congress who are not particularly happy with that. He also wants to issue pardons for the highest ranking military officers in the Confederate Army, which was something that enraged, again, a lot of radical Republicans. And the basis of the 10% plan was this last bullet point here, right? All that the 10% plan required was for 10% of the voting population, and that is as of the 1860 census, right? Or the election, rather. Every 10% of those people, if they took an oath of loyalty to the U.S. government, and then ultimately established a provisional government to become a state, that provisional government would be recognized, and they would be well on their way to becoming a state again. So we already talked about the implications of this. 10% is a very small percentage. This means that there could be ultimately some pretty ardent Confederates that still exist in these states, but the states could still reassimilate. So it was seen as very dangerous by a lot of the radical Republicans in Congress. But still, it went through for 3 states. By 1864, you had Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas reassimilated to the Union. And I just realized I way overspoke. This is really embarrassing. I'm sorry. I was just really not thinking about years right here. So I wanted to make a major correction here. I just said that the surrender was in 1863. That was ridiculous. I blame the lack of coffee, right? The surrender wasn't for another 2 years, right? The surrender was in April of 1865. Thank you, Miss Sutton, for being awake. So this means that the 10% plan was actually under development ever since, really, the last stages of the war. I would say, though, by December of 1863, Lincoln already had it in his head that the Union was going to win, because this was after Gettysburg, this was after Chancellorsville, this is after Vicksburg. So it's looking pretty good for the Union. So sorry about misspeaking there. Just wanted to make that clarification. In any case, so with the 10% plan, you have Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas forming provisional governments, getting ready to reassimilate into the Union. One of the problems there, though, is that they really have to sort of abide by everything that the but that the Republican-controlled government was ultimately requesting them. At this point, there was still martial law that existed mainly throughout the South. So ultimately, you're going to see that that the North ultimately is still very much policing Reconstruction policies in the South. If there's martial law in these southern states, that means that the North really acknowledged that it would be incredibly difficult for the South to just reconstruct itself in harmony, right? There was too much racial tension. There was too much animosity, especially because the South lost the war. So the North had to maintain a military presence in the South to make sure that things went relatively smoothly. So the Wade-Davis bill was the radical Republicans' response to Lincoln's 10% plan. The Wade-Davis bill was much harsher on the South. They upped the percentage from 10% to 50%, right? So that meant that a majority of the population of these seceded states had to not only swear a loyalty oath, they called it an ironclad oath, just kind of suggesting the strength of it. So it went a little bit beyond the oath of loyalty. The ironclad oath, you were meant to swear that you had never, at least voluntarily, aided the rebellion. So it's really difficult to get 50% of any of these seceded states to actually take this claim and be honest about it, right? The South was not completely unified in their desire to secede, but there was a pretty significant momentum behind the secession movement. Many Southerners were very much in support of secession, states' rights. So to say that they had never aided the rebellion is a pretty high claim. But in any case, that's what the Wade-Davis bill required. It also required that state constitutional conventions had to be assembled before these states could elect state officials. So basically it's set forth like a protocol for establishing statehood again. And also it very deliberately made it so that these states had to protect the new liberties of freedmen that had been established. And this is one of the most, I guess, contested points of the Wade Davis bill as far as the South is concerned, because they don't want civil liberties for the emancipated slaves. So the Wade Davis bill does pass both houses of Congress. Just a few things to elaborate on. Charles Sumner, who was very much a radical Republican in Congress, we already know him because he was caned in 1856, right? He argues the state suicide theory, and essentially that said that the states that seceded had effectively committed suicide, right? And so it was his belief that they would need to go through the whole process that territories had gone through to become states, right? So they would have to assemble provisional governments. They would have to draft a constitution. As the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are added to the Constitution, these states are going to have to ratify them. Because otherwise, there was no guarantee that these states wouldn't return to that sort of Southern pre-Civil War mentality that was so that was seen as so dangerous. So the other politician that we should acknowledge here as a radical Republican was Thaddeus Stevens, who was also an ardent abolitionist, very much a radical Republican. And he argued this conquered provinces position, and so that essentially meant that all the states that seceded should be treated like conquered provinces of war, right? So he believed that they should not be given constitutional rights because essentially they had committed treason, and they would have to go through a lengthy process to be trusted again by the federal government. As we said in class, this bill passes both houses of Congress, but President Lincoln pocket vetoes it, which implies that he could have passed it if there had been modifications, probably if it became slightly more lenient. But as we know, Lincoln died before that could happen. So we'll explore Reconstruction under Vice President Andrew Johnson in just a minute. I also wanted to bring to your attention that the former president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, actually was arrested after the war was over. But Davis is a more controversial figure than that. You might think, well, he was the president of the Confederacy. Clearly, he was a traitor. But actually, Jefferson Davis expressed outrage when he found out about Lincoln's assassination. But Union forces, nonetheless, actually believed that he was involved in the assassination plot for Lincoln. And they issued a $100,000 reward for his capture. Eventually, he is captured. He's imprisoned. But later, he's going to be issued a pardon by President Johnson. So Jefferson Davis is seen as a war criminal immediately after the war, but his pardon by Johnson actually further suggests why he was impeached, but also just why he was so unpopular among the radical Republicans of Congress. All right, so one of the most major changes of the Constitution is that there are 3 new amendments that are added over the course of the years of Reconstruction, right? The first is obviously the earliest. It's ratified in December of 1865, and it's the 13th Amendment. So I'm not going to reread the text here. I just want to summarize. Ultimately, what the 13th Amendment said was that slavery, no matter where we are, is now abolished, right? So it takes the Emancipation Proclamation and applies it to everywhere. Okay, so basically no longer will there be any slavery, okay? It does make a slight exception when it says except as a punishment for crime whereof, but we'll discuss what that means in the future. Ultimately, what this really means is that slavery is over. It also specifically states that Congress shall have the power to enforce the legislation, which we're going to see is something that a lot of southern states actually do not do. A lot of southern states are going to pass state legislation to try to find loopholes to Reconstruction policies. So this part is actually pretty blatantly violated, in my opinion, throughout the Reconstruction years. Another thing that is done fairly early in the Reconstruction process that we talked about is that the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be established. The formal name is called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, but we always just call it the Freedmen's Bureau for short. Essentially what the Freedmen's Bureau did was it provided employment, education, and legal support, amongst a few other things for emancipated slaves, which we now call freedmen. The initial Freedmen's Bureau was only meant to last 1 year, which is, I guess, sort of overly optimistic that all these things can be actually achieved in 1 year, but it eventually will last longer. A lot of Northern abolitionists actually were seen as really risk takers to help establish things like the Freedmen's Bureau and really help establish civil liberties for all African Americans. The idea was that they were also subject to scrutiny. It was not unheard of for white people to actually be subject to lynch mobs. Oftentimes, white people who came from the North and relocated in the South for a number of reasons were given the name carpetbaggers. So here's a cartoon that represents carpetbaggers. Ultimately, think about it as like a person who just picks up picks up just enough of their belongings to essentially like go on the road, throw all of their things in a carpet, right? Bag it up and then migrate, right? That's a carpetbagger. But it's a very derogatory term. Southerners saw carpetbaggers as people who were taking advantage of the post-war chaos in the South and trying to gain more political rights, try to, of course, establish more equality for Black Americans. Carpetbaggers, in a lot of ways, were seen as like, kind of taking political power away from the South. They oftentimes ran for and were elected into office politically. So you can kind of see from the Southern perspective why this was threatening. But you could also make the argument that the so-called carpetbaggers very much had good intentions for, extending Reconstruction throughout the South. Okay, so like I was saying earlier, the Freedmen's Bureau was very much criticized by the South. They kind of saw it as ultimately a way to empower a group of people that they saw as lazy and useless. It's really hard for us to swallow, but that's how they saw slaves, right? They saw them as ultimately inferior, not even citizens. They still saw them as property, right? So this cartoon is sort of a satire of that, right? Plenty to eat and nothing to do. The idea that the Freedmen's Bureau kind of, it was almost like an early form of welfare in their minds. So that is, that kind of gives us a sense of how the South received this. Freedmen's Bureau schools were set up throughout the South. We can talk about the differences between white and Black education in the South in class if you're interested. But ultimately, the Freedmen's Bureau, you can imagine if it only had a 1-year charter, if it was very much protested in the South. Freedmen's Bureau schools were by no means equal. They oftentimes didn't have enough supplies. A lot of times they had multiple grades in one classroom. Occasionally you had, actually quite frequently, you had a lot of times white female teachers. It was sort of seen as a female profession. You would see a lot of white female teachers coming from the North and then teaching in these Freedmen Bureau schools. And in a lot of ways, they were seen as sort of pioneers for the education system among freedmen in particular, but also it was sort of seen as a major segue to get women more involved in the education process, right? So Freedmen's Bureau, it was somewhat successful, obviously, but it was limited in my mind. All right. So, as we know, Lincoln was assassinated, and his vice president was Johnson, rather. Johnson was a Democrat, actually, which is problematic in terms of the Reconstruction process, because we know that the majority in Congress, it's an overwhelming majority of Republicans. So he automatically sort of butts heads with Congress, just in that sense. Lincoln actually wanted him to be his vice president in 1864 because he wanted to represent a more moderate base, right? So Lincoln's vice president in his first term was Hannibal Hamlin, but then Lincoln replaced him with Johnson, who was seen as a war Democrat, right? Johnson also was very much sort of anti-elitist. You could say he was sort of fundamentally opposed to the Whig Party that now no longer exists. He also was a white supremacist. He was pretty openly racist. So obviously that's problematic if you think about the parts of Reconstruction that are very much oriented at establishing more civil liberties for Black Americans. He did actually believe that the secession process was never legal at all. So he and Lincoln saw eye to eye on that. But the real problem with Johnson, honestly, was his sort of racist mentality and the way that Congress saw that. And this is ultimately, in many ways, going to lead to his impeachment, although the technical reason for his impeachment was different. Okay, so Johnson's plan is sort of an extension of Lincoln's plan. So you could think of it as the 10% plus plan. So think about it as lenient, right? It did not require a ironclad oath like the Wade Davis bill. It required a simple oath, right? So basically, if 10% of the population, or the voting population rather, of the South offered a simple oath to the Union, they would be able to set up those provisional governments to become states again. There was one exception, actually two exceptions to this. If you were a Confederate military officer, or if you had a significant amount of property, you actually could apply for statehood, or you could, you could actually sort of bypass that loyalty oath and then appeal directly to Johnson to segue into the Reconstruction process. So actually, Johnson was kind of even more lenient in that way, right? So actually, there's sort of a loophole with that. People who had these major military roles in some ways were actually given a slightly more lenient treatment than probably what Lincoln would have wanted. Also, these states had to accept minimum conditions repudiating slavery, secession, and state debt. So in other words, this meant that whatever legislation up until that point that had been passed about slavery, these states would have to accept, right, before they could become states again. So basically that meant that as Reconstruction legislation and amendments were established, these states would have to abide by them. So like the 13th Amendment, for example, was something that these states would have to ratify, acknowledging that slavery was over before they actually could become states. This plan also established provisional governors in the states. So basically, this meant that the president actually had the authority to appoint these governors. These governors also, their job was to oversee elections for constitutional conventions. But I guess the problem, if you think about it, was that if Johnson, a former Democrat, is appointing these governors, he's not necessarily concerned with protecting the civil rights of blacks. He might sort of look the other way if blacks are disenfranchised. Okay, I misspoke again slightly. Sorry. Some of the small logistical details I tend to sometimes misspeak on, so I just wanted to clarify here. I was actually mistaken when I said that these were actually treated more leniently. Let me go back. So the 10% plus plan ultimately meant that everyone who had not been sort of directly involved with the military elements of the Confederacy could offer that simple oath. If you were a military officer, though, then you had to actually go directly to the president. You couldn't just swear the oath, right? And if you owned significant amounts of property, you had to do that too. So that meant basically that these two people here, would have to go through a slightly more lengthy process. So actually, Johnson, even though he had a lenient plan, there were some Confederate leaders that were briefly disenfranchised. Planter aristocrats sometimes got presidential pardons, and what you saw was Johnson's plan was definitely seen as too liberal by the radical Republicans. So there's going to be a lot of pushback from them, and you could say that this sort of leads towards his impeachment. Just a cartoon that's sort of questioning the end of slavery here. And of course, as we know, this is far from this whole plan is going to be far from actually extending full constitutional rights to African Americans, right? So what we're going to see is that a lot of these southern state constitutions actually did not do what they promised. So a lot of them did not actually guarantee the civil liberties for Black Americans. A lot of the provisional governors were very much sort of among the former Confederate mindset. So a lot of radical Republicans are going to be really disappointed with this plan. Johnson is very much in favor of pardoning former Confederates, so he does so with over 13,000 former Confederates, which is going to really upset the North. And it's really also going to empower the South to sort of take Reconstruction into their own hands. They feel like actually the states do have a lot of independent authority outside of the federal government. So eventually states are going to take advantage of that, and they're going to start to pass their own legislation. And it comes in a variety of forms, but they all fall under the umbrella of black codes. These are state laws that essentially limit the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They make it so that Black Americans can only hold certain jobs. A lot of times there are only certain places they can go. Sometimes they have curfews. There were vagrancy laws that were established, which meant that if you were sort of just walking around with no intended duty, like say you were just kind of hanging out in front of a store, you could be arrested because they were saying, "What are you doing here?" Right? It's like kind of hanging out in front of a 7-Eleven. You could get arrested for doing that, right? So this is very much limiting the mobility of former slaves. It's not reestablishing slavery by any means, but it's really relegating Black Americans to second-class citizens, right? So elaborating on black codes a little bit more, right? Black codes were seen as a way for the South to sort of reassert their control over the labor market. It made it so that Black Americans could only have certain jobs. So that meant that a lot of their jobs were primarily agricultural. The South really wanted to keep their cotton industry as king. It's going to start to establish a sharecropping system, which in my mind is really not far off from feudalism in Europe. Sharecroppers were tenant farmers, which meant that they never owned their property. They would lease it, right, from a plantation owner. The term sharecrop meant that they paid their rent by sharing a certain proportion of their crop yield to their landlord. But they also would oftentimes borrow supplies, tools, seeds, right? And that would be part of the debt that they owed to their landlord, as well. And so what you found was sharecroppers were frequently in perpetual debt. Some sharecroppers were illiterate, so sometimes their landlords would explicitly cheat them out of their contract and make their debt last that much longer by saying, "Oh, you didn't pay this off." They would charge interest. In any case, sharecropping is seen by a lot of historians as essentially a continuation of slavery. Okay, so at this point, Congress is incredibly upset with Johnson, as you can imagine, right? They don't see him as attempting to carry out that radical plan that the Republicans came out with. So Congress is really trying, as the South starts to reconstruct and start to establish statehood again, the radical Republicans in Congress are trying to do everything they can to stop Southern congressional delegates from coming to Washington and voting. So eventually Congress is going to create a joint committee on Reconstruction to deal with these issues. They also very much are using this joint committee to try to make sure that Andrew Johnson is accountable. And we see that maybe this was needed because in February of 1866, Johnson's going to veto the Freedmen's Bureau bill. And then the next month, he's going to veto the 1866 Civil Rights Act. And what's really interesting about this is that both of these vetoes are going to be overridden by Congress. And if you remember, to override a presidential veto, you need a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. So this is huge. This is the first time that they ever were able to amass that supermajority to override a presidential veto. So that shows you really how opposed Congress was to the president, and also how much of a Republican majority they really had, right? So that's going to obviously segue into impeachment, which we'll deal with in a few slides here. In 1868, the 14th Amendment is going to be ratified, which in my mind actually is the most significant amendment out of these three, right? Because it applies far beyond Black Americans. What it does first is it establishes the provisions for citizenship, right? It says that all persons who were born and naturalized in the United States were guaranteed citizenship. So that meant that all former slaves, since they were born in the U.S., were citizens, right? This is meant to stop the neo-Confederates from continuing to assert control over the former slaves, right? So basically, like making the citizenship of Black Americans trump the attempt of the Confederates in the South to keep ruling them, right? Also, they want to be able to repudiate the debt of the Confederacy and assume it into a large national debt, which is sort of a side note. We don't really think about that with regards to the 14th Amendment, but this was sort of a way that the federal government was able to help deal with a major debt crisis that was accumulating after the Civil War. Really, what the 14th Amendment is meant to do at the time was to try to punish southern states for denying voting rights or other basic civil liberties to their black citizens, right? But eventually, we're going to see that the 14th Amendment applies to any person who was born in the United States that is maybe denied certain basic civil liberties. So actually, quite often now we apply the 14th Amendment to especially people from Latin America, people from Spanish-speaking countries, right? Most notably, of course, from Mexico. The idea is that if you, even if you were from another country, if you give birth, your child is automatically a U.S. citizen. The 14th Amendment is actually subject to scrutiny by some more conservatives in government now. Some conservatives go so far as to say they want to repeal the 14th Amendment. So anyway, that's a little bit of continuity and change for you. Okay, so this is just going to indicate to you the sort of the proportion of black versus white in the population of all these different southern states. So the states, the numbers in blue are the most interesting because we see that in South Carolina and in Mississippi, there's actually a black majority. So this is really interesting to us because you could argue this might be the place where there's the most significant white pushback. These states are also seen as very deep South, right? So there's quite a bit of racism, a lot of white supremacy. You're going to see that when the Ku Klux Klan arises, they're going to be very strong in these two states because in a lot of ways, white citizens have the most to lose because there's a black majority, right? So that's just something to pay attention to as we move forward, right? In 1866, we're going to have a by-election. That means there's no presidential election. There's a congressional one. But what's really significant here is you see that the Republicans have a massive victory in the 1866 election. They're going to win a 3-1 majority in both houses, right? They're going to gain control of every single northern state, right? Johnson, thereafter, was ultimately attempting to really sort of reestablish himself. He really, in a lot of ways, was threatened by this huge Republican turnout. So he launches a tour around the United States that we could see as the propaganda tour. He's trying to push his lenient 10% plan throughout the country, but we see that obviously it's going to be limited based on the election results. In a lot of ways, this sort of reestablishes, or this kind of grants a mandate for the Republicans in Congress because they see it as the people speaking. The voting population wanted Reconstruction if they voted so overwhelmingly for Republicans. So this kind of pushes the radical Republicans forward, and it makes them that much more adamant about doing anything they can to stop the president, even if it means impeaching him, which we know will happen. Spoiler alert. Okay, so again, we have some pretty radical plans for readmitting these states into the Union at this point. We have martial law in the South. We actually have for quite some time. Martial law, in case you're having a brain lapse, is where the military ultimately is present in these places, right? You're going to have military presence all over these seceded states. In one of their major roles is to ensure that the 13th and 14th Amendments are honored in these southern states. They want to ensure that black people are voting. This is going to be seen as very problematic by whites in the South because they're surrounded by their in their mind, their enemy, right? It's almost like, think about leading into the War of 1812, where there were still British troops stationed in the Americas, right? They think that the war was over, and they don't like that there's still Union troops there. To a certain extent, you could empathize, right? So anyway, this radical plan is going to require new state constitutions where they have to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments, right? So basically, if you are not yet a state under Reconstruction, you have more that you have to do to get to that point. And I already explained the purpose, so let's move on. So Congress is going to pass a series of Reconstruction Acts in 1867 to, again, assert quite a bit of control over the South in the Reconstruction process. One of the most interesting ones in my mind is this first one, the Military Reconstruction Act. So what it does is it actually divides, it's very much an assertion of martial law in the South, right? It takes the unreconstructed states, so all these states that are in green on this map, and it actually splits them up into 5 different military districts, which means that, these states are actually, in a lot of instances, as you see here, are going to be combined. So, Arkansas, Mississippi, they're just one district, right? And the idea is for the federal government to really be able to keep an eye on these states. Again, with martial law, they are observing voting patterns among the newly enfranchised Black Americans. They also are very much doing this because these 10 states that had still not been reconstructed were refusing to ratify the 14th Amendment. So you knew right then and there that they were not going to be particularly friendly to Black Americans. So we see in the Union mind why they saw martial law as necessary. A couple of other acts that are passed, and actually this one is quite significant, so I'll talk about that in a moment. The Command of Army Act made it so that the president had to issue all Reconstruction orders through the commander of the military. So it kind of, limits his executive power in the military in that element. More significantly, though, is the Tenure of Office Act, which says that the president cannot remove any officials, so they can't fire any officials, especially cabinet members, without the Senate's consent. All right. So again, the president is not allowed to fire anybody without the Senate's consent. All right. So this is only if the position originally required Senate approval. So as you know, when you appoint cabinet members, you have a Senate hearing to confirm those appointments. Those were the types of people now that the president could not fire, right? And so this was designed to protect the radical members of Lincoln's government, right? So basically, there were a lot of people in cabinet positions, in executive positions that had actually been appointed by Lincoln. And the radicals in Congress are really afraid that Johnson's going to get rid of them and appoint people who are less radical into these positions, right? So actually, historians still question whether this law was constitutional. But in any case, the law is passed, right? And what happens is very shortly after the law is passed, the president breaks it. Johnson is going to fire the Secretary of War, this man here, Edwin Stanton, and immediately after he's fired, the House of Representatives is going to move to impeach him. All right, so that's what happens. February of 1868, Edwin Stanton is fired. All right, very, very quickly thereafter, the House moves to impeach him. Then, as you know, with the impeachment process, after the House impeaches, the Senate then holds the trial. The trial lasted 11 weeks, and Johnson is indeed acquitted, so he's not removed from office, right? But just, again, as a little bit of a civics review, in order to impeach, you need 2/3 of a vote in the Senate, right? They were only 1 vote shy of that 2/3 majority. So if one more person had voted to remove Johnson from office, he would have been fired. Many historians argue that the reason why he was not removed is because A, he was the vice president, right? There is no vice president at this point, right? Because he was the vice president. So the next person in line would be the president pro tem of the Senate. And he was a guy named Benjamin Wade, who was actually seen as a less ideal candidate than Johnson. And the other thing is that even though Johnson was not removed from office, when you are impeached, that's a serious check on your power. So Johnson really does not do much after that to get in the way of the Reconstruction plan. All right, so shifting gears, let's talk about social stuff. And actually, I think this is a great place to stop for now, because I want these videos to be in reasonable chunks. So I'm going to take a break here, and then we'll start with another video. All right? Thanks for watching.